Okay, we're, of course, farther behind already than we'd ever expected due to the fascinating material that's been put in front of me, so I'm going to try to carry us forward quickly. It is my pleasure now to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dr. John Kelly, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary of Energy for Nuclear Reactor Technologies. Dr. Kelly was appointed to his position in October 2010, and as a former prisoner of the Beltway, I have to say that suggests that he has tapped into some kind of unconventional energy source already, because the average tenure of someone in a position such as his is 2 years or less. I am especially grateful to Dr. Kelly for making it here because there are no slack days at DOE, and I think he's done us an enormous good deed an enormous favor by joining us. His office is responsible for the DOE Civilian Nuclear Reactor Research and Development portfolio, which includes DOE's programs on small modular reactors, light water reactor sustainability, and Generation 4 reactors. It's also notably responsible for the design, development, and production of radioisotope power systems, principally for NASA missions. So when your kids are marveling at all those pictures that we get, just think of Dr. Kelly as being responsible for them. In the international arena, Dr. Kelly chairs the Generation 4 International Forum and the International Atomic Energy Agency's Standing Advisory Group on Nuclear Energy. Prior to joining the Department of Energy, Dr. Kelly spent 30 years at Sandia, where he has been engaged in a broad spectrum of research programs in reactor safety, advanced nuclear energy technology, and national security. His reactor safety research, interestingly, focused on core melt progression phenomenon, which has led to an improved understanding of 3 Mile Island. A native of Detroit, Dr. Kelly received his BS in nuclear engineering from the University of Michigan in 1976 and his PhD in nuclear engineering from MIT in 1980. It is a great pleasure to have him here, and I hope you'll give him a warm welcome. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back in New England. I was just down the road, I guess, several years ago now. But let me tell you about a couple of recollections before I get into my talk, which is really going to focus on what's going on in the world in nuclear today. But I was a graduate student when 3 Mile Island happened at MIT, and it was about a year away from graduation. And our class all huddled at one of the father's bars on Mass Ave, and we go, oh my God, did we make a big mistake? Because in 1972, where he made the choice to go into nuclear engineering, we were going to have 1,000 reactors by the year 2000. This was the up and coming. That and chemical engineering were going to be the highest paid engineering jobs in the country at that time. And the best and brightest went into nuclear. So this was quite a moment. Some of us, I was in thermohydraulics area, and pleasure to meet you, sir. I've read your books, and it's always, did I solve all the problems? I was okay in thermohydraulics. And I also like the connection with computer codes and modeling, because that was what my forte was in the modeling and simulation, especially in thermohydraulics, and then later into severe accidents. But anyway, those of us in that area worried a lot about safety at that time. And so those of us that had a safety bent figured, hey, maybe there's going to be some opportunities here. Those that wanted to design new things, they were probably not seeing such a fortunate future. But after leaving MIT, I went to Sandia, and at that time, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission had gotten the wake-up call that basically they didn't understand what was going on in this accident. They couldn't quantify core melt progression, hydrogen production, fission product release, whether steam explosions could occur. You can just go on and on and on of all these things. Now, it turned out that Professor Rasmussen at MIT had led a study in the mid-'70s called WASH 1400 that for the first time had brought this new technology at the time, probabilistic risk assessment, to bear on the question of what are the risks of nuclear power. And they had highlighted that we were looking here at some big pipe break as being the thing to worry about, and it's this little pipe break over here that's actually the more risk significant thing if you put it in the right context, the right mathematical framework. And that was sort of like no one noticed that until 3 Mile Island, and then everybody said, oh yes, you know, the small break LOCA, the stuck open relief valve, was in fact, you know, now the more likely and more risk significant type of event. And what the surprise to the community was really that a small break could actually lead to a core melt. Now this brings me to a point about all of the complex engineered systems that we have today, whether it's nuclear power plants, airplanes, oil rigs, et cetera. These are very complex engineered systems. And our problem as engineers is that we actually don't know how they work perfectly. We have lots of approximations. We don't know geology that way well. We don't know how seismic events can trigger tsunamis. So there's lots we don't know about the complex world we live in. And the problem is that when these systems get beyond their design base, where we have some confidence, we know how they work, we actually have very little confidence. And it's at that point that the human comes into the picture. And if you look at most of the major tragedies of complex engineered systems, it comes back to some human error as being the ultimate reason. But you know, I would contend what we've done is sometimes built systems that are so complex that it's really a little bit unfair to put all the blame on the human. But you'll see that at Fukushima now, that it's a man-made exercise is the head, or a man-made accident is the headline in Japan. And if you looked at the Kemeny report, you saw it was the operators that got the blame. But in fact, the system was pretty complex and people didn't know what was going on. So I think what's happened over the last several decades has been to increase our understanding, or increase our scientific understanding of these systems, of what can happen and what cannot happen. And I think we are in a much better position today than we were you know, 35 years ago. And a lot of that had to do with the research that me and my colleagues did at Sandia, where we actually would melt down fuel rods, we would have hydrogen explosions, we'd do steam explosions, we would test containments to failure. And it's through that kind of disciplined severe accident research and then the incorporation of that information in computer codes that led us to doing these new risk studies that actually show that as Professor Wallace you know, indicated, that the health effects are negligible. In fact, Fukushima will probably demonstrate that. But the actual economic consequences, the psychological consequences are very high. So I do think that the quantitative safety goals that the NRC uses is something that is useful, but the way we deal with the economic goals is through insurance, basically. And I think there's going to be a legitimate debate about whether that's the right approach going forward. But nevertheless, I came to the Department of Energy about 3 years ago after a long career in doing severe accident research and other things at Sandia in New Mexico. And I was told at the time that I would never get to meet the Secretary of Energy, who at that time was Stephen Chu. And I said, great. I had retired from Sandia, and I had actually hired in at DOE, so I'm a career Fed now. So I'm not, appointment is kind of a weird word, but anyway. So, you know, lo and behold, about 4 months into my tenure, this, you know, we had actually had a group of Russians, the nuclear folks in Russia at our headquarters, and we were having a bilateral meeting with them, discussing how to cooperate, et cetera. And, you know, we're driving into work and we hear about this earthquake tsunami, and all of us in the know kind of realize this is not good. You know, they need to be getting water into the core as soon as possible. And because you know, the word was out that they had lost you know, power, et cetera. I've been to Fukushima. I've been on top of the reactor building that was blown up. And you know, you can see the towers had collapsed. They had lost their power. They would have probably been okay had the tsunami not come and flooded their diesel generators that caused the complete loss of power. But fortunately, from an information perspective, we'd been studying severe accidents for 30-some years and had computer simulations of reactors very similar to the ones at Fukushima. And so within days, we had stood up a massive technical team, And the secretary tapped into me, and I ended up briefing him twice a day, and we kind of walked through this crisis together. And it actually lasted a lot longer than the TMI crisis. It's still, I would still say that in some sense it's ongoing because there's still lots of uncertainties. But nevertheless, we had a pretty good handle, and this was very important to bring some calm. You know, we knew this is bad, but we think it's under control, and there were lots of concerns, and there was always this kind of constant debate as what can happen next, what can happen next. But I think because we had taken the time to invest in the science and technology, we were able to answer some of those questions. Okay, so with that, I'll be glad to talk to anyone later about some of those insights, but it certainly has been interesting for me in my time here at the Department of Energy. And I'll tell you, I still am optimistic about nuclear because a couple of things. One, if you looked at I think the Mark Wald's curve showed that the nuclear kind of stopped in a certain year. Well, what you'll notice is that all the electricity growth was taken up by coal. And of course, you could debate the consequences of CO2 versus nuclear, and I can tell you where I come out. In terms of the impact on the human planet, and the carbon is probably a lot worse thing. And so the stagnation in the nuclear, whether it was because of economics or whatever, have led to a horrific change in a potential change in our climate. And now the question is, how do we mitigate that if we don't do nuclear? And my personal opinion is it's impossible. Okay. So either that, and I'll have a slide about what it could mean. But this is going to be a real challenge to society. The other thing that Mark talked about the upfront capital costs, and all of that is absolutely true. But if you look today, nuclear power is the least expensive form of electricity that's being produced in the country. That's even with natural gas prices where they are. And that's because the loans have been paid off and the improvements have made, the uprates. There's lots of reasons, but they are cash cows today. And the question is, how do you build new when you have to wait such a long period of time? I'm sure this dilemma faced the investors in the railroads back in the mid-1800s, where they saw this great thing called the railroad. Of course, people like Vanderbilt built it and profited from it, and were able to, and now we're very dependent on that system. But at the time, I'm sure it was a huge capital risk. And I think these things all come around again. But I think one of the reasons why the economics, or why the economics aren't sustainable right now, and it's probably true not only for nuclear but for renewables, is because of a lack of a clear direction on climate policy. If you leave it to the marketplace will go for low cost, quick turnarounds, and this will be carbon intensive. I can guarantee that. And it's only through government policy, whether it's state, local, regional, or federal policy, that actually puts some value on a couple of things. One, on reducing carbon emissions, and on the energy security you get from having a diversity in supply, so that you're not at risk from one supply being short or another. Then you will not, the marketplace will not go to the right place to meet those goals. And so right now, the marketplace does not value either carbon emissions or lack thereof, or diversity of supply. So just a couple of perspectives from my view. But to get on with the talk, this really all began in what would be now the 60th anniversary last December of President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace. It was a bold strategy. People were at that time scared of nuclear weapons, and there'd been enough evidence in the laboratories in the U.S. and probably elsewhere that we could make nuclear power commercial. You basically make heat, you turn the heat into, you boil water, you turn a turbine. It's pretty straightforward technology. But the real idea was to take the power of the atom, which had been made people so fearful, and turn it into something that was beneficial to mankind. So that kicked off in 1953, again, just a little over 60 years ago. And that led to what I'll call the first wave of nuclear deployment. A couple of things were going on in the world at that time. Countries like Japan and Germany and in the US were finally recovering from post-World War II, and their economies were emerging and they were needing increased energy. So when you look at those curves that, again, Mark had showed, that steep demand was really, I think, a large part recovery from World War II and the retooling and the prosperity that was coming in the 50s and 60s, et cetera. Of course, in the 70s, we had the oil crisis. I remember not being able to get gas in Boston. The only way I could get gas is if I took my car in for an oil change, I left it overnight, they would fill the tank, and so I had frequent oil changes in that car in order to get gasoline to go anywhere. And the government was strongly backing. Of course, this was an outgrowth of Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace, which propagated for, I think, several decades, this idea that nuclear power is good for mankind. At that time, there were some things going on too that I can remember, but they were all neutral. Acid rain, where trees were being destroyed. I remember driving through Pennsylvania and seeing the devastated landscape from the deposition of the remnants of coal plants. Air pollution in California was horrific. It wasn't coal. It was the car emissions, probably mostly. And there's really unknown study, although I have a copy. It's an MIT press. It was an MIT symposium in the early 70s about a topic called inadvertent climate change. A report of the study of man's impact on climate. Of course, this study was not important at that time. Right now, if you go back and read it, it's like the blueprint of what everyone's talking about as a given today. So again, the little unknown things at that time kind of come to bear. So right now, acid rain is not a problem. We figured out how to scrub coal. We've figured out how to clean up emissions by putting noble metals into the chemistry of the system. But we really haven't come to grips with the climate modification issue yet. In terms of discouraging drivers at that time were high interest rates. I remember trying to buy a home in 1980. It was very, very difficult with interest rates about 16%. People did not understand radiation, and so they were afraid of it. There was still a strong fear of nuclear weapons, and the Cold War was in rampant phase. The 3 Mile Island happened. I think that it was discouraging, certainly, because it again showed the vulnerability of all of us to having too much trust in our engineered systems and not a belief about what can go, or not having that questioning attitude about what can go wrong. Chernobyl didn't help either, although we just sort of discarded that as non-US technology, so it didn't really matter. And waste management began to become an issue that we're still trying to come to grips with. But the positive news, I think, from Atoms for Peace was really that in a short period of time, a couple of decades, we went from 0% nuclear electricity to something that was on the order of almost 15% worldwide and 20-some% in the OECD countries, the more developed nations. Realize in 1953 this was 0, and now this is the picture today. Some countries like Sweden and Finland are heavily nuclear, 30, 80, almost 40%. US is 20, Canada 16, but Ontario is 50%. Someone was talking about the regulated markets in the Southeast. The Southeast is one of the fastest growing parts of the country. People are going there. They need electricity. The markets are regulated because it's good for the economies of those states, of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida. I mean, I can't imagine living in those places without air conditioning, and that needs lots of electricity. And that has enabled states like Atlanta, states like Texas. The air conditioning has really enabled people in the workforce to go there and have a high quality of life. So electricity really does have a huge benefit, and if it's clean like nuclear, that's important. Okay, so that's what the situation is basically today, and again, I'll call that the first wave. Important thing here, and I'll come back in a minute, there are two countries, India and China, that basically didn't ride the first wave. They're down in a few percent nuclear. And there's probably lots of reasons for that, but, and you'll see in my hypothesis that's coming up that's going to be important. But today there is very strong interest in nuclear power if you look at IAEA studies, and there's lots of different reasons for it. Maybe first is energy security. So I think the shocks of the oil embargoes of the 70s, we're still feeling it today. I mean, countries are still cognizant of the day. This is why countries like Japan and France invested so much in nuclear, because they didn't have the indigenous sources of fossil fuels, and they needed to import, and they didn't want to put their economies at risk, based on world politics, crises in the world, et cetera. So it really provides that sheltering. Plants do get old. Nuclear plants or coal plants do get old, and they will need to be replaced. And so, in order to maintain that energy security, it will be important to be, for some countries, to be looking at replacing the older units. Other countries, on the other hand, are rich in fossil fuels, and they've come to the conclusion it's better to sell that product on the market than to burn it at home making electricity. It's actually more expensive because of the way their pricing structure is. And so countries like the Emirates, Saudi Arabia are now looking seriously at a significant amount of nuclear power to preserve their fossil fuel resources. Other countries are worried about replacing coal because of air pollution problems, and this is especially true in China. I've been to Beijing, I've seen what it's like. You actually can't see what it's like because you can't see. They said in that mist over there is where we had the Olympics, and I go, great. It was better on TV at the time. Apparently, they'd shut off all the coal plants during the Olympics so that they could have those Kodak moments. But nevertheless, it's not good. And the fact of the matter is, in China, the coal plants are in the west. They put up all the particulate and CO2, of course. That CO2 is not causing the air pollution. But the wind blows from the west to the east, and so the eastern part of the world in China has this issue. And the air quality index is going down, and et cetera. So they have a very strong interest in nuclear. And finally, there's the worldwide concern about climate change. And nuclear is the only emission-free base load. The other sources are intermittent. And if we're looking at some of the newer nuclear technology, like small modular reactors, these can actually run without water cooling. They can run with dry condenser cooling, which really then eliminates one of the other things that you have in any kind of thermoelectric cycle is significant water usage, because about 2/3 of the heat that you produce has to be rejected to the environment, and that's usually through water. Now, okay, this is cool. This is cool. It's showing me the next one, so I can, prop. But basically, on this issue of carbon emissions and GDP, I think this is maybe a familiar plot. We borrowed this from Steve Koonin, who used to be undersecretary at the DOE. Undersecretary for Science. And basically, there's a strong correlation between CO2 emissions and basically the prosperity, or as measured by GDP per capita. And basically, there's several countries on here, and it's about a 25-year period. Each dot is a different year. And so as the recessions happen, not only does GDP perhaps go down, but carbon emissions go down. But what we see is, in general, carbon emissions and GDP are correlated, and if we are truly interested in quality of life for the entire planet, then we would like to have, in principle, GDP everywhere in the world increase. And at the same time, we'd like to reduce carbon emissions. Well, that's the desired thing. What we probably don't want to do is decrease GDP in order to reduce CO2 emissions. This is probably going in the wrong direction, because this will probably then cause other kinds of crises, unintended consequences. People will feel that there are haves and have-nots, and this can create quite a bit of instability. But really what you would want to do is decrease carbon emissions while increasing GDP. So this is the promise of the clean energy economy. Now, if you look at the chart, the only country that's actually, it's kind of hard to see, but France has actually demonstrated this. This bright red. Bright colors. Yeah, I know. There's only so many colors in the wheel. But France is the yellow there, which you can hardly see. But they actually, their GDP went up while their carbon emissions went down, and that's because of nuclear electrification, where about 80% of the electricity generated in France comes from nuclear power. So, again, is that the only answer? No, but I think it's certainly part of the solution. Now, looking forward, what are the plans? The plans are very ambitious, and I think Mark pointed out that the plans in the U.S. are ambitious. Plans are plans, okay? Getting the shovel in the ground, that's when things become a reality. Getting the loan, that's when things get to become a reality. But right now, there are 435 reactors. That represents something on the order of about approximately 15%. I think that's that and hydro are about neck and neck in terms of carbon-free emission electricity. Those are the two largest sources, nuclear and hydro, on a worldwide basis. And if you look at just the OECD countries, nuclear is by far the largest non-emitting electricity source in the developed world. There's 72 reactors under construction, mostly in China. Lots of plans in 27 countries, lots of new countries that would like to get into the market, and I'll talk about that in just a second. And there's lots of proposed things over the next several years. In terms of the actual plans, here's a chart that shows several countries that have had nuclear power plants and are planning new ones, and some information on their per capita, size of their grid, the actual status, et cetera. I'll just point out a couple of things. China is actually looking at huge growth, something maybe on the order of 200 plus reactors over the next 20 or 30 years, something akin to what the US did in the 70s and 80s. So it's not unthinkable. It's certainly possible if you have the will to do it. The UK had a particularly unique type of reactor that probably wasn't, for many reasons, its life couldn't be extended, and et cetera. So there's a plan in foot now to retire all those plants and replace those with, I think, light water reactors, whether it's French or US or Japanese design. A lot of that's still to be determined. But basically, something on the order of 16 gigawatts, which it comes in today at about 10 plus reactors at several sites within the UK to replace their entire fleet of gas-cooled reactors. And the US is 5 plus, and we'll see what happens there later. There's a lot of new entrant countries that never had nuclear power plants that are very interested. I mentioned the Emirates, their desire to sell fossil on the market and not burn it. Vietnam is also coming out of its war, and its economy is developing, and so the need for power is increasing there. Turkey, Jordan, et cetera, down the list. Lots of interest, lots of, I wouldn't say concern, but the countries that have nuclear do want to make sure that new entrants are capable. And so the IAEA has been actually putting together some very, very good approaches to helping new entrants actually develop the regulatory framework, safety culture, all the lessons learned that we have from the current operating fleet, and try to translate those through training, other opportunities to the emerging nations. But I heard about the nuclear renaissance in the U.S. Or it being maybe dead. Well, actually, the nuclear renaissance, if you look worldwide, is in full steam ahead. And I think the renaissance maybe started in Italy, and I don't think Italy actually ever benefited from the first renaissance. So anyway. Whether the U.S. benefits from the renaissance that's being driven in China, I think we will, because they are certainly interested in U.S. technology today. But if you look at the data, they are 80% coal. This is the electricity production, 2% oil, 1% gas, 15% hydro, and 2% nuclear. And I think if you look at most of the developed nations, they tend to target something around 20% nuclear electric generation. Turns out that's about the amount of power that most countries need at night when the demand is the lowest. And so if you want to run your nuclear power constant and you have 20%, the numbers work out just about right, that you can run those constantly and pick up the nighttime and then use other sources for the peaking times. China has 20 reactors under construction. I've been to a couple of their sites, 20 in operation, 28 under construction, and I've been to some of the construction sites. More about ready to start construction. Ambitious goals in the next 6 years, put 58 gigawatts on the grid there, 150 by 2030, and much more by 2050. China, has made the decision to become self-sufficient in reactor design, but they're leaning heavily on Western technology to adapt it and improve it. And they did make the decision, though, that their indigenous designs were of the generation 2. That's the generation that are actually operating today. And they decided that one's under construction they would complete, but no longer would they build that older design, that they would go to the Gen 3. And Generation 3 is really the first time, and these are the new reactors being built today, where the lessons of TMI from a engineered perspective have been incorporated. And the particularly important thing there is using passive safety, where instead of relying on engineered safety, where you have to pump water into the system to remove the heat even after shutdown, you rely on natural processes. You rely on gravity to basically move the water through the system and cool the core. And this was one of the kind of lessons of TMI, the over-reliance on engineered systems, where you have the opportunity to turn them on and off. Could be a problem if you have a natural system relying on gravity. It's going to work with or without operator attention. Now, in terms of the U.S., the public is seeing nuclear as having a vital role. Now, this is probably, this is an average across the country, and it's probably regionally different. But this was a study done by the Nuclear Energy Institute, survey. And I think what's interesting here isn't so much the statistics, because you can take them or leave them, but I think the bottom line was that if you look back in 1984, the public support for nuclear power is about 35%, and today it's about 70%. So public support, one way or the other, has doubled. And this could be because we've forgotten. I think it could be that I think people are generally concerned about CO2 emissions, the climate, and they see nuclear as a piece of the solution. Now, in terms of the U.S., what's the status of the new builds? Well, the Gen 3 reactors, as I indicated, are a major evolutionary step in reactor technology, incorporating this passive type of technology. They're the first new reactors being built in the U.S. in 30 years, and it's already been talked about the completion of Watts Bar reactor and the 2 units in Georgia and 2 units in South Carolina, and they're actually rising above, either the containment dome there is shown in the one. So they are actually on pretty good progress. And it turns out there's like 4 sister plants being built in China of the same design, and so there's lots of learning in the construction area going on between our countries. Will they be on time, on budget? The probability of that is pretty low, I would guess. But will they have the significant kind of cost overruns we saw in the past? Hopefully not. Hopefully we have learned how to do project management better. We have risk management, all the types of tools that the business schools have developed to help us manage projects are actually coming into play into how we do these now. But nevertheless, there's still some significant challenges with new nuclear construction. A high capital cost has been talked about. That's certainly still there. Electricity demand is actually lower. So it turns out right now that our carbon emissions are at a lower level than they were. Well, it's because our economy went in the tank. And you have to look at that trade-off to, again, going down and to the right rather than, down and to the left is not the direction you want to go. But you can actually reduce carbon emissions by having major recession. Low natural gas prices is going to put pressure on nuclear. And there is still some uncertainty about how Fukushima will play out in terms of safety requirements for the new plants. So Secretary Moniz, he was at MIT and came in about a year ago. He is a very strong supporter of nuclear in general, but in particular for small modular reactors. So we see these small modular reactors as a gap. Reactors that have lower capital cost, are safer, and can be manufactured in the U.S. as an opportunity to really help build a new industry within the U.S. And he's talked a number of times about our commitment to maintaining safe and secure nuclear power, not only in the U.S. but in the globe. Lots of good reasons for SMRs. I think safety comes first. Because they're smaller, they're easier to cool, and coping time is a measure that we use to talk about safety. What it is how long can a reactor go without a kind of operator intervention. The Fukushima reactor was supposed to be about 8 hours. It turned out to be about 5 hours, so that was kind of the time constant for when you needed to actually take action with the Generation 2 kind of plants. For Generation 3, the ones that are being built now, 72 hours. So it's about an order of magnitude increase in coping time, going from half a day to something a little over 3 days. The SMRs are looking at 2 weeks to a month. Another order of magnitude increase in coping time. This is really, really important. And at the same time, they've been simplified to eliminate potential events, so there's no large pipes anymore. They can be located below grade, which helps with protecting anybody worried about security, as well as seismic events. They become more robust potentially. And all these lead to the fact that maybe the emergency planning zone could be reduced just because of the fact that they are safer, have lower source term, are more robust against the insults that Mother Nature may throw at them. From an economic side, because of lower capital costs, they could reduce the financial risk. And it's not only lower capital costs, but with lower capital costs comes lower interest rates, and therefore the overall project cost goes down. The operators can add units one at a time, so it's sort of like playing Monopoly, where you first build houses and then you finally get a hotel on your property. So you don't have to buy the hotel to begin with. You can sort of build up to that. One of the things that we're looking at is potentially replacing retiring coal units with some nuclear solutions, SMRs in particular. And the issue with coal is that localities have grown up around the coal plants. So basically, you have much higher population densities around coal plants and traditionally have been around nuclear power plants. And so the safety of these and the reduced source term, et cetera, is one of the things that we're looking at to see whether this really makes sense from a siting perspective. There's energy security reasons, and I think the job creation and skill creation is another important reason for why we're interested in SMRs. Now, worldwide, there's also lots of interest in SMRs. Russia has a barge-mounted unit that they plan to deploy along the Arctic Circle, parts of their country, where it's very difficult to, right now diesel fuel is the answer for electricity at those locations, so they can put a reactor on a barge, put it into port, and power the city. Korea has been developing an SMR called SMART, on the order of 100 megawatt electric pressurized water reactor. And they have plans to build a demonstration in the next few years. China, too, is looking at small modular reactors. The case in China is that right now I think all of their plants are located on the China Sea, so they're on the coast. They really need to get the plants deployed inland, but I think there's concerns about water usage, potential contamination of their food and water inland, and having a reactor such as an SMR, that could be much safer, reduced source term is of interest. China is also building high temperature reactors, and these can be used for industrial applications. And Argentina has a small reactor that I believe is supposed to come online in about 2016. And it's going to be used for electricity and as doing research, and then they have plans to scale that up over time in the 2020s. And that sort of brings us to where we have taken light water reactor technology, and that's taken us through first the early prototype, which was Gen 1, the plants we have today, which are the large power stations, which is Generation 2, the plants we're building today, the Generation 3 that bring in the passive safety, and then the next generation is really the revolutionary designs that have the potential to have better economics, much safer, less nuclear waste generated, and more proliferation resistant. But this is going to take some major breakthroughs in the technology. The systems that are under consideration in the Generation 4 program are shown here. There's 3 fast neutron systems, a sodium-cooled, lead-cooled, a gas-cooled reactor. We've built sodium reactors. The Russians have built lead fast reactors. No one has built yet the fast gas reactor, so that's a really advanced technology. Very high temperature reactor. We've built high temperature reactors, not very high, and so this would be a new kind of beast. The molten salt, we had experimental verification of that back in the 60s, and so that concept is there. And supercritical water reactor, this brings in supercritical water technology from coal fossil plants together with nuclear to create kind of a new concept. And so what happened about a little over a decade ago was 10 countries got together and said, let's put together a research portfolio where we all share the research results. This was actually the first time that developed nations got together to work on fission systems. Certainly The world has gotten together to work on fusion systems, but this was the first effort on fission systems. And this led then to the Generation 4 concept and program. And I can say that over about the last 10 years worldwide, there's been about a $5 billion investment in these types of technologies, and progress is being made. In fact, China right now has in operation a sodium fast reactor, and they're designing a much larger prototype system. And under construction is their first Gen 4 system, a high temperature pebble bed type of design. And they also have sort of an innovative reactor called a fluoride salt cooled reactor that is being designed at the Shanghai Institute of Applied Physics. Russia too is building. They're completing their BN800. They've been scaling up their fast reactors over several decades, and now they're at 800 megawatt electric, supposed to start up next year. That will be followed by a 1200, which will really be the first Gen 4 large reactor, I think, that we will see. It's supposed to be competitive with the SMR, or with the light water reactors. They have a new test reactor, and they're also working in lead bismuth, lead fast reactor technology. So lots of activity elsewhere in the world in the Generation 4, and one of my French colleagues is here. There's a program in France called Astrid, and Frank, maybe you'll talk about it, but it's a sodium fast reactor that's under design in France right now with hopefully we'll move forward in the next few years to final design, construction, and operation. So in summary, I today see strong international interest in nuclear energy. It's because of the need for energy, concerns over climate and the environment, and the economic benefits that it can bring. The current construction, China is leading the nuclear renaissance. I think that's pretty clear. I think we're making good progress, but I think the success of these first 4 plants is going to be really telling to whether the renaissance kicks up again in the US. I think the SMR technology can be game changers. It solves a lot of the issues that the large plants have and really complements them for markets that nuclear has never been able to penetrate. And I think the Gen 4 program, it's an R&D program right now, moving into sort of demonstration of technology. It still has a few years to go, but I do believe that there's a strong promise there. So when you talk to our secretary, he'll tell you about all the above, all of the above strategy, and it's really not a decision that limits our economic. It's really about the opportunity that we can invest in clean energy technologies in markets that are forming right now, and really be at the forefront as those markets develop in the future. So with that, thank you, and glad to answer any questions. Yeah.
There's time for a couple of questions.
John, how important do you think the artificially low natural gas prices are in the U.S.? Our prices are about 1/3 of what they are in Europe and 1/5 of what they are in Japan.
Well, I think everyone believes that at some point there'll be some equilibration of those differences. I mean, we're not exporting now. If that starts, then we could expect maybe to see some change in that. But I think actually the low natural gas is a huge benefit to our energy security right now and our economy. And I think we shouldn't, I'm not against it. I think it's really important. The key is how do we get a clean energy policy in place that allows us, natural gas actually helps. It emits about half the carbon dioxide to the atmosphere than from coal, so that's a real plus. But I think it's viewed as a bridge to a clean energy future. And so the key is how do we get that long-term view? And I think that's really the key. Natural gas enables a short-term view, and technologies like nuclear, wind, solar that are capital intensive, need long payoff times, really force you to the long-term view.
You referenced waste management impacts. Could you elaborate on that? You see that?
Well, I think Secretary Chu formed a Blue Ribbon Commission that came in and made several recommendations on how to move forward with waste management. I think from a technical perspective, there's certainly a variety of ways of dealing with long-term storage, long-term safe storage of nuclear waste. I think the issue is really The heart of the issue is really how do you get the consent of the local people, and I think this is really a socio-political type of question. And I think if you look at the Blue Ribbon Commission's report, they point to this need for a consent-based process. If you look in countries like Sweden and Finland, they have adopted that type of process and are moving forward with their repositories. I think that once those repositories, probably Sweden and Finland, they're kind of neck and neck who will open first, they will demonstrate to the world that that's the way to go, and I think this will maybe break the logjam. So right now, though, we don't have an answer, and so we're investing our resources in looking at how can we safely store the existing spent fuel, how long can we actually store it, and these types of technical questions, so that when we do have an answer, we do have the ultimate repository question settled, we'll be able to move the fuel from where it is now to safe locations. And we've made a proposal to open an interim interim storage facility as basically a way to begin to get the information, the data, the technologies needed to safely handle spent fuel after it's been removed from reactor sites.
Could you just touch on the other end of the formula, the mining of uranium supplies and the increasing difficulty of getting those supplies and the cost of the environment?
Well, I'm not an expert in that area. I do know that there's been significant breakthroughs in situ where you basically, you don't have open pit mining. You basically inject water into the ground, dissolves uranium, and you pump it out and extract it that way, which has much significantly reduced environmental impact. Most of our uranium is coming from Canada or Australia right now, so I'm not exactly sure what question you're asking there. I'm not familiar with those operations well enough.
Well, I read about it and I'm concerned by what's left behind and the effects to local communities. It can be rather devastating.
Well, what was left behind was what was there, so I'm confused. So, I'm not sure. I think there were practices in the 50s and 60s that are no longer applicable. Now, if you're talking about practices back then, there certainly was a lot of concern about the practices at that time. I think the whole, at least in the U.S., the concern over that has led to very significant changes in the practices to reduce the environmental impact and potential health effects to others. I don't know what the situation is in other countries, though.
One of the things that the prior panel had talked about a fair amount was the effect of variable renewable energy coming onto the grid and how that might challenge the viability of nuclear going forward. How do you see that playing out?
Well, this is a big engineering problem, basically. It's a complex system, this grid we have. It was designed for one reason, and it's now being asked to do something else. And there probably has to be significant changes. People talk about smart grid, et cetera, but it basically, there's also policy factors that have to be looked at. I mean, right now there's a requirement that in certain places that certain amount of renewable energy has to be taken onto the grid. Well, if that's your policy and you execute it, then this is going to come at the detriment of something else, right? Wind, for instance, can operate at actually negative cost, but because of production tax credits, can turn a profit. So you're basically shutting down perhaps nuclear power, which is a clean, non-emitting source, in favor of a new clean emitting source, simply over a policy issue. It's not a technology issue. So I think we have to come to grips with these kinds of questions. I think the good news is that the cost of renewables have come down, so that achieving goals such as 20% renewables in the next beyond the hydro, which looks like it's going to be stagnant at about 10% in the U.S. for a lot of reasons, but actually growing the renewable contribution is going to be a good thing long term. But we have to deal with this issue of these fluctuations and come to some rationalization. Certainly, you don't want to have to build up basically 2x your capability in order to take into account that that snowy day, I drove into work yesterday at DOE, and we have a array of solar panels, and they were covered with snow. And it was a perfectly blue sky day, and I was just thinking, you know, when we need you, we have snow, you know, and so it's really one of those things that you can't predict it, and so you'd hate to have to, you know, basically brute force it and have 2x the capacity with all this natural gas or coal or other things just sitting idle, waiting for the day when you know you have a 2-week no sun type of period.
And so new reactor designs aren't being designed in such a way that they might be more flexible to account for?
Yeah, that was one question that came up earlier, that the practice in the U.S. has been to run baseload. The practice in France has been to be more of a load following capability. And elsewhere. So reactors can be designed. It has to do with control systems, some of the specifics. The small modular reactors, we think, will offer the opportunity to have that flexibility to, you know, ramp up and ramp down, you know, more quickly. The problem is you don't get a lot of warning. So, you know, cloud's coming. You got about 15 minutes. Can you actually execute the procedures you need to do safely at the nuclear plant to bring the power down so that when or up, you know, depending which way the cloud bank is coming. And these are the systems problems. So it's really complex systems problems. I can tell you there's a lot of research, people developing models, trying to understand this, and then what can be done about it. Yeah.
Thank you for this nice overview of plants and nuclear energy, what's
This one?
going to be built globally. Are there actually any numbers how long our resources in uranium and materials to fuel those power stations will last if all of this is realized? And at what price are those resources available? Will it be similar to what we see today, or will it increase?
Yeah, I don't have that off the top of my head, but I know it's well over 100 years given the current situation. And if you go to fast reactor technology, it's basically endless. I mean, it's thousands of years, because you basically go from a very low utilization of uranium to extremely high, 2 orders of magnitude increase in uranium utilization if you go to a fast spectrum. So, and the other observation is that this is an area we have research in right now, is that it is possible to extract uranium from seawater. It's probably the most expensive way to do it, but if you can figure out a technology that allows you to do it and figure out the cost of that, you could actually cap the total cost, because basically the supply of uranium in the oceans is unlimited. And so right now we're looking at that as a way to give us an upper bound on the cost of uranium, and then factor that into studies, because the decision will come: do you go to a fast system to extend your uranium resources, or have you fixed the upper price with confidence, and so you don't need to go to the fast systems? I think time for one question, or that's it. Great.
Thank you very much.